channel will be talking about a lot of different stuff, but we needed to get started today with OpenAI. So I'm starting to get a lot of customers, and I think a lot of the information I can cover in a video instead of having one-on-one conversations with lots of customers. So with that, let's just go ahead and get started. I think everybody's heard of OpenAI. They've played with OpenAI. What we're going to talk about today is introduction to OpenAI, the models a little bit, and we're going to talk about some possible architecture patterns as well as give you some demos. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. I have a GitHub repo which will be linked at the bottom of the video, so you'll be able to open this repo and get started. If you and this is about Azure OpenAI specifically, not OpenAI the company or OpenAI the public, the Microsoft outfacing. So you can imagine that Azure OpenAI would actually be an OpenAI model deployment in your subscription, and we'll talk about what that actually means throughout the video. But the first thing you're going to want to do is get access to it. So on the GitHub link, you'll actually see that the register for OpenAI access. This will give you access to basically GPT 3.5. Right now, it takes less than a day in many cases. That may change in the future because we're pretty much letting a lot of folks get access to it so they can do some tryouts. And keep in mind that this is still, as of today, mid-June, we're still in basically public preview. So before you go to production, you might want to think carefully about, what if we yank a feature? Because that has happened in the past. GPT-4 access. Once you have access to this, you can apply for GPT-4. As of mid-June, they're blocking any new customers from coming on board just due to demand. We're trying to keep up. We'll go through some of these other links a little bit later. The Azure AI Content Safety, Azure pricing page. We'll talk a little bit about that and why it matters related to the model. And then the most important thing that you're going to need to talk to your security and legal team about is data privacy and security inside of Azure OpenAI. Because that's one thing a lot of customers get tripped up on. They're like, yeah, we don't want you using our data to train your next model on. And that's an absolutely fair point, and we don't, for what it's worth. But we'll talk about that, and you've got the links here too that you can go through as well. So to start with, we're actually going to go to the GPT-3 models page on the Azure documentation. You can search for this pretty easily. But what I wanted to talk about is the fact that when you get OpenAI enabled in your subscription, it's not one model that you have access to. It's all of these models that you can get access to, especially with the GPT-3 models. Obviously, when you get access to GPT-4, there are some other models that are be available to you. The GPT-4 and the 432K, which actually has more tokens, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But what I wanted to point out on this one was that you'll see that the main models we're talking about are the Ada, the Babbage, the Curie, and the DaVinci. Okay, so those are going to be the models that you're typically going to use to get you started with whatever OpenAI feature you want. Text summarization, document summarization, respond to an email, help me write an email, things like that. The max request tokens for DaVinci, if you look at this, is going to be, for DaVinci 3, text DaVinci 3 is going to be 4,000 tokens. For the rest of these, it's going to be around 2,000 tokens. So then the question becomes, what is a token? Well, basically a token is how a word gets divided up. One way you could think about it is as a syllable, even though that's not exactly accurate. Another way to think about it is each word is approximately 0.75 tokens on average. So if you've got a sentence that's got 10 words in it, you can pretty much figure out that multiply that out, and you'll figure out that you could have 12, 13, 14, 15 tokens in that sentence, depending on the size of the word. So that's one way to think about it. And there are some tools out there, and you can actually implement in your code to count the number of tokens, and you can actually send it in and get a token request back as well to see how large it's going to be. But that's something to keep in mind is you can't send in to DaVinci a 5,000 page document and expect it to come back with a summary because it's too many tokens. And there are some architecture patterns we're going to talk about that will allow you to do that. Now, there's another thing we need to discuss here as well, and the best way to demonstrate it is on the pricing page. So if we look at the pricing details for these, like I said before, Ada, Babbage, Curie, and DaVinci are the core models that you're going to be using for text analytics. And that's A, B, C, D, so you can kind of get them in order and remember them that way. It's kind of a mnemonic, A, B, C, D mnemonic that you can kind of remember which order they come in and which capability they come in. Now, you can see that per 1,000 tokens, DaVinci is going to cost you about 2 cents per call. So for 2,000 tokens, 4 cents per call, etc. And you'll notice that Curie, Babbage, and Ada are less expensive. The reason for that is the capability of the model. DaVinci is the most robust model. Curie is slightly below that. Babbage is slightly below Curie. And Ada is slightly below Babbage. So one thing I would think about, and I've been talking to customers about, is when you start your POC, and I wouldn't just throw an OpenAI model into production with no testing, but I would definitely do a proof of concept in such a way that maybe you start with DaVinci and then you see how DaVinci is behaving with you and your users, which, your POC should include a few actual users. So you can kind of get an idea of the behavior of the model and the behavior of the users, because there's going to be some prompt engineering, even when you ask it a question that we're going to talk about later, where you need to figure out, it's like, what's the proper way to communicate with a model? So, but one thing you can do is start with DaVinci and the POC, and then maybe do some A/B testing against DaVinci and Curie, and see if Curie will provide enough information, if it does a good enough job, because you can save yourself quite a bit of money, or even Babbage or Ada in some cases. And then obviously we have the code ones, which if you've looked at GitHub Copilot, that's an example of the Code Cushman and the Code DaVinci. And obviously the Code DaVinci is relatively expensive, as is the Code Cushman. So if you decide to create your own Copilot for software engineering, you might want to be cognizant of the prices of that. And then ChatGPT, which is going to be basically the interactive chat session that we're all used to seeing right now. And there are some use cases for ChatGPT as well as for Text DaVinci. Most of what we're going to be using today is going to be Text DaVinci that we're actually going to go through. So we'll get started with that next. All right, let's go back to our GitHub repo for just a second, where we've got our links out here. So one of the things, I've got a useful repos in here, OpenAI links and resources, which we talked about already. I've also got a section called useful repos, and this will grow over time as I find more content, more folks that have published content that I think would be interesting or useful for you. So we'll actually go through that a little bit today. But there are a few that are out here that I like. I've deployed all of these at some point, except for the OpenAI.NET samples. I haven't deployed that one yet. And I've actually been through these Jupyter Notebook samples as well. So one easy way to get started is to actually come out here and start looking at these notebooks, because the penalty for getting started is very low. Have Python, have Jupyter installed, and have an OpenAI account in Azure, and you can go ahead and get started. So that's going to be relatively simple for you to work on. But we'll go ahead and get started. Let's start by looking at some of these Microsoft Azure OpenAI samples. Okay, with that, let's go ahead and get started with one of our repos. Let's go down and look at our Jupyter Notebook. We're actually going to start out with the Azure OpenAI examples. This is probably one of my favorites. So we'll jump into that. What we're going to be going through today, if you drill into that, we're going to go to examples, demo. You'll notice there's several out here you can play with, but we're going to start with demo, the demo IPython notebook. So you can take a look at this in your GitHub repo. And just clone the repo just like you do with everything else. But let's go ahead and get started and see what that looks like. So I've already got this set up, and this is typically what you're going to do to get your Jupyter Notebook to communicate with Azure OpenAI. Notice we're using the OpenAI package, and we've got the service type, API type, the base, the version, the key, and the model that we're using that's actually set up in Azure OpenAI. And you'll get your own URL and you'll get your own key from that, so it's not a big deal. But let's go ahead and get started. So create a list of 10 locations with no internet, white sand beaches, no cars, and the island is accessible only by canoe. So what we're going to start with is we've got a temperature of 2. We've got some things we got in here. The engine model, which we said is DaVinci. The prompt, which is this thing we set up here. And a temperature of 2, and max tokens is the number of tokens to return. Temperature of 2 is kind of important because 2 gives it, basically it's telling it you've got a lot of flexibility in what you can return. So when you do 2, you could get a different answer every single time. But in this case, we're just asking OpenAI, it's like, hey, based on your own model training, what you know, what can we actually do with this? If you were to set this to say 0, for instance, and run that again, what you'll get back is the same answer every single time. So there's no flexibility in the answer. So the temperature is going to be important when you're searching your own documents, because you don't want it to be very creative when it's searching your own documents, doing a summary and giving a return. You want the answer to be pretty much the same every single time. So that's something to think about. So if we run the 0 again, we'll actually see that we're going to get the same answers back again. And if we go back to, and the range is from 0 to 2, but if we go back to a temperature of 2, you'll see that basically we could get a random response every single time. And that opens up the world for hallucinations as well, so be careful. It's like you don't want, if you're searching your own documents, you don't want to be doing that. Other things you can do with OpenAI is, this is a fun one. We actually are passing in a table as a string into the stock prompt. So you can see here we have basically stock information for a day, or for a couple of months actually. And you can ask it a question, take the stock prompt, which is the data that this table is, and then concatenate on what did this stock close at on 120. So you can come in here and give it, an answer. Oops, I didn't run the whole thing. So we'll run that. And when it'll come back with an answer, we'll see that it closed at 84.72 on 120. And if we go look at 120, we'll see that it did in fact close at 84.72. And this is another one where you want to be really careful with your temperature, because you may want to set this to 0 because you don't want it being imaginative in its responses. So if we set that to 2, for instance, let's see if it comes back with the correct answer of 84.72. Luckily it did. So, but yeah, to keep that in mind when you're working with temperature. You may want it to be very specific in what it comes back with. What was the average price? And this is another one where when you're doing mathematics with this, you're going to want to do some testing to make sure that it's coming back with the right answer every single time. The other one, I don't have the code prompt set up right now, but you can also do a code prompt in here. Where you can actually pass in, the following, basically give it the stock table that we were just using, and then load the variable stock prompt as a CSV file. And we're giving it instructions on having it create a pandas script for us, or excuse me, a Python script for us using pandas, so that we can actually do some stuff on it. This is what it came back with when the original author wrote this. I don't have the code set up in my environment right now, because it would, instead of being DaVinci, it would actually be DaVinci Code. It'd be a different model that we would be using. We'd be not be using the normal ChatGPT. But like I said, when you get your subscription enabled for OpenAI, you'll actually see that there's a lot of models that you have available to you that you can use. And anyway, it generated the code, and then you can actually pass in. Take a look at that. This is where basically Azure OpenAI starts to shine, and this is where people start lighting up typically, is what can I do with it. In this case, we have a contract prompt, so let's go ahead and start with that and load it up. And I'll go ahead and get all that running for you. But yeah, so in this case, definitions, I agree to acknowledge and represent the following, blah, blah, blah. What happens if I miss a payment, for instance? So this is a loan contract. And it will come back with a response and ask, what if you miss a contract? It'll tell you, the lender and other loan participants may report this information to credit bureaus. So that sounds fair. What can the lender do with my information? And then it'll actually give you a summary of from that contract, what can the lender do with your information? So this is a good one where you can actually have it write a summary or ask it questions against the data set, and it will come back with an answer. And once again, be careful on your temperature, because that's where you're going to get some flexibility in the response. In some cases, you may want it to be very flexible. In other cases, you may be like, nope, I want you strict answer every single time. Call use case. So this is actually a call transcript that you may want to look at. So in this case, we have a caller calling an agent, and they start out with, hey, how's it going? You've been looking at my portfolio and all this. So we can actually run this through here, and let's go ahead and run it and get all the answers back out. And basically they're concerned about the performance of their portfolio. So if you have someone where you need to get some themes or whatever out of a single call transcript, you can actually, in this case, generate detailed call summary notes from the text that we had put in the call prompt. And then we get the call summary. John Doe called because to discuss portfolio performance, which has been underperforming the major indexes. So that's great. Generate a list of topics discussed from the call, and then basically it will generate a list of what the key elements were that were discussed in the conversation to save you quite a bit of time. Generate a list of follow-up tasks for the agent from the text. So this could be something: analyze the current portfolio, develop outlook. So it actually has a lot of context about this call. And it's making some pretty sound recommendations for what goes on. And the last one, how was the caller verified by the agent? Verification, the agent verified the caller by asking the caller's name and the last 4 digits of their account number. This one's a fun one, the disgruntled call case. This one is an individual that got mad at the phone tree trying to get to an agent because they bought something that broke immediately after they plugged it into the wall. Not only did it break, it started smoking. So they're calling the agent. They're mad because there's soot all over their office now, and they're getting ready for a triathlon. So that's the gist of this angry caller that's calling in. So what you can do instead, you can read all that on your own, but we'll go ahead and load this up so you can see it. And we've got the transcript. And the call summary is they're frustrated by the automated call tree and the amount of time it took to get through to a human being. They purchased a device, like I said, it started smoking when they plugged it in. Anyway, so you kind of got the gist of what the summary of the call was. It lists the mitigations the agent used in the call: apologizing, offering a replacement product, expressing empathy, offered to expedite delivery, expressing appreciation, wishing them good luck with their next race. And then I thought it'd be fun. It's like, let's write a knowledge-based article for future service agents to see how OpenAI would respond. It's like, if they can figure out the context of how can I use this call to teach someone else that maybe how to mitigate an angry customer, how to de-escalate. And it did a really good job. So this is something else you might want to think about using as a way to do that. So, but all right, let's go and move on to our next topic. Okay, so let's move on to our next topic. So we're going to go back to our GitHub repo for useful repos, and we're actually going to start with the third one, ChatGPT Enterprise Data with Azure OpenAI and Cognitive Search. This is an architecture pattern that we're probably going to see more customers adopt, or something similar to this. So this is the loose architecture, to where we actually have a user, app. We have an orchestrator, which is going to be the application server. Now, here's the thing. When we think about OpenAI, we probably are not going to have our users we're not going to deploy an OpenAI endpoint and let the users run wild. There is a scenario for that, and we'll talk about it in a few minutes, where you may just want OpenAI to be available to your users to do document summaries of their own documents, or email summaries, or help me generate an email, things like that. And we'll talk about an architecture pattern in a few minutes and how that would look, so that if you still wanted something like OpenAI in your own Azure subscription where your data is protected, that may be necessary. And we've got some actually really good, interesting use cases for that scenario. But more likely with several customers, most of my customers that come to me with, they're like, we have PDFs, we have transcriptions, we have things like that. We want to create a system to where, like for our HR documents, for instance, where our customers can actually, or our users can actually come in and ask questions of documents that we have preloaded into something. And that's where this pattern comes in, because the way this will actually work is you would preload your documents, take a PDF, for instance, run it through Forms Recognizer, get the text out of it, load the text, index it in Cognitive Search, so that you can run a query against Cognitive Search, get the relevant documents back out, pass that to OpenAI, and then see if we have an answer for the question or not. So, and that's kind of this pattern we're going to talk about, the first pattern we're going to talk about. So the data in this repo is in the, like I said, it's in the SQL shell, so you can take a look at it. But the data that we actually have is we have basically created a fake company. We have the benefits options, which is our Northwind Health Plus benefits, our Northwind Standard benefits, Perks Plus, which are the perks you get for working for the company. Basically, it's like $1,000 or $1,500 reimbursement for gym equipment and gym memberships and fitness devices, things like that. The employee handbook, and the role library, which is a list of jobs that are at the company. So the way this particular repo works, it will actually go through, run through some scripts when you initially set it up, run a series of Python scripts that will actually go in and take these documents, divide them up into single pages, pass them to Forms Recognizer. And then from Forms Recognizer, they'll actually get indexed in Azure Cognitive Search. So what will end up happening is I will end up with a blob storage account that has taken my multi-hundred page documents and divided them into single pages. And the reason for that is, if we look at this is what the repo looks like when you actually get it deployed. And it's the GPT Enterprise sample. And you've probably seen this before. I think it's been done at some Microsoft conferences, but now you can actually go deploy this on your own if you so choose. So you can ask it questions against the documents that we have loaded. What's included in my Northwind Health Plus plan? So we'll wait a second and it'll come back. But one of the things I want to be clear about is there's context here. It didn't say what's included in my health plan, what's included in my Northwind health plan. That prompt engineering is an important thing to take note of, because here's what's going to happen. If we click on the light bulb when you do this demo, and this is where you're going to need to start worrying about prompt engineering and how users are interacting with the system. It searched for Northwind Health Plus Plan Benefits Comparison Standard. Okay, which isn't exactly what I put in, but basically it took this query that I had put in, the question that I put in, and restructured it. Now you'll see there's a prompt here. You are an assistant that helps company employees with their healthcare plans and questions about employee handbook. Be brief in your answers. Answer only with facts listed in the list of sources below. If there isn't enough information below, say you don't know. Do not generate answers that do not use the following sources. This is called prompt engineering, and this is something that you would actually do. Because if we go back, because then the next question is, where did that code come from? So we're going to go back to the app. We're going to look at the back end, and basically we're going to look at these, and you'll see that this is one thing you'll have to spend some time learning is LangChain at some point. Because what will happen is if we look at the read retrieve, for instance, let's see if this is the one. Yep. So we'll see that we've actually got some Python library, and this is actually the back-end code that's running in an Azure App Service right now that's doing the lookup for us. So if we come back here and take a look at this, we can see, let's get that out of the way a little bit. We can see here that we actually have the template prefix, which is what we saw just a second ago. You are an intelligent assistant helping Contoso Inc. employees with their healthcare plan questions. And then it goes through. And you'll notice that each one of these approaches, actually, most of them have something to where it's trying to, depending on which package or which file we have to hit, which function we have to hit, you'll get a different prefix. So it may be a little, you'll notice some difference between the LangChain prefixes. But what ends up happening is this will actually get passed in as part of the prompt, which is what we saw right here. That's where this is coming from. And then we'll also see that it came back with a document. So it's like, yeah, here's the document that we found. So if we can't pull that down, there we go. So citation, this is the page where the information was actually stored. So, and they pulled this from blob storage because when the initial script ran that created this entire website, it also went through and processed all the information we had about the data. And that was where I told you that it read these documents in, divided them into single pages, sent each page to Form Recognizer, and then loaded that into the index search with a reference back to blob storage so that it would be able to do this. And we can look at the supporting content because even though it just came up with the options 2 page, there could be more content out there. And then we can look at the thought process and figure out, what were you thinking when you asked this question? And ways to trip it up, because I think that's important as well. What roles are there? I'm going to ask it kind of a vague question. Let's see if it can come back. And it's kind of variable. I'm sorry I cannot answer this question in the sources provided. Now, I mentioned already that there is a roles library out here that I should be able to look at. Roles and descriptions at Contoso Electronics. So we know that it was uploaded. I uploaded it. So let's look at the thought process. Employee healthcare plans is where it searched. Roles in the employee handbook. So it was partway there. So let's change that up a little bit to a different question. Let's just restructure the question. What roles are there at Contoso Electronics? Let's see if we can do a better job. Can't answer that question. Provide, and this is where I've seen this, and I've seen this repetitively. Let's see here. Provide a list of job roles at Contoso. Don't need a question mark. Let's see if we can get it here. There we go. So now we got it. Let's look at the thought process for this one, see if it comes up. Roles, Contoso Electronics Employee Handbook Healthcare Plan. So until we actually narrowed it down, let's see if that's the same text. Job roles, Contoso Electronics. So the prompt engineering matters because we were trying to get for what it searched for. And this is where you're going to have to do some testing. And this is where you're going to need to do some testing with your users to find out what kind of questions are they asking. One way I've kind of jokingly described ChatGPT as a 3-year-old with infinite knowledge and no context. So you have to be very specific about how you ask it a question. And you know, more details and more context, the better. Because you can see this is a good example that it kept missing the point until I finally broke it out just a little bit. Now, once we've done that, you can actually go in, because since we have the role library, you can actually come in and say, what does a and I didn't put do on there, but let's see if it'll figure it out. What does a vice president do? The VP of Research and Development is responsible. And we'll see that we've got the role library and the employee handbook. So we can actually go through and get some context. Vice President of Human Resources. That's resource. There we go. Research and Development. So that's the first page, even though we didn't get the second page. Let's look at the other one. The Employee Handbook number 9 is where it found it. Vice President of Product. So it actually had 2 references for that. So we'll come back and do that. So this is a good way to get started in ChatGPT, just because this will kind of get you going to see how it behaves and search your own documents, which I think is going to be really important. Many customers that have come to us and have asked, it's like, look, we either have a document library or we have transcripts. So there may be a different architecture pattern depending on what you're doing. And in the next part, we're going to talk about, next few minutes, we're going to talk about the way you can do this with other data and how the architecture pattern might look. So the next architecture pattern we're going to take a look at is actually relatively easy. We're going to do the Cosmos DB and OpenAI ChatGPT. This one's relatively simple. There's not if we have an architecture here for it. I don't think we do, because basically it's just ChatGPT with your data being stored in Cosmos. Which I kind of like. And you're like, well, and what's interesting about this one is we're not loading any documents in. This might be a version, let's imagine a version of the world where you gave your users access to ChatGPT in a protected Azure subscription. And you wanted them to have the abilities to go through and ask, questions like, for this case, who is Harry Potter, which we can all figure out. We all know who Harry Potter is. But there's no documents based on this. But, you may just kind of want to keep it as a basic search engine. Now, here's where it could come in handy. Email summarization or meeting summarization. I missed a meeting. I'm not going to tell you what it was this past week. It was about an hour and 10 minute long. I took the transcript from the meeting and I divided it up into 4,000 tokens. So it was 4 sets of 4,000 tokens for a 1 hour-ish meeting. And I ran it through ChatGPT to get the highlights of it. Much like the Teams transcription, I did my own version of that using this Cosmos. And I'll show you why Cosmos is involved at all. But that way I could actually summarize the meeting without me attending it. I'm not encouraging you to start skipping meetings and summarizing transcripts with ChatGPT, but if it happens, it'll save you an hour of time from having to go back through the meeting. And then if there's something interesting, obviously you can go back. But what I can do is remember from the Jupyter Notebook a little while ago, we had the mad caller. I took that transcript and we're going to pass it in. Summarize the following. And we're going to pass that in, and we can see that this came out with about 559 tokens. And we can see the speaker is frustrated with the company's automated call system, which is what we saw before. So this looks very familiar. So we still have this down here. Summarize the following in bullet points. This might be useful for users to be able to come back and figure out, what's a way to summarize large sums of text? And let's just, instead of doing that, write an email to the customer apologizing. Spelling. If you misspell stuff in ChatGPT, shockingly, it figures it out. I can't tell you how grateful I am for that. Write an email to the customer apologizing for the issues. And let's see if it can still keep the context and remember what we sent in. I'm writing to apologize for the issues you experienced, whether automated call system and malfunction of your device. So this is one where you might empower your users to actually get a little bit more work done a little bit quickly. I mean, obviously writing that email is not going to take 10 minutes, but it's still going to take some minutes, and it's going to take a context switch from whatever you're doing daily. So this is kind of interesting. Now on the back end, let's look at where this is, because what I wanted to show you here is this is my Cosmos DB account. And you'll see that I've got basically the items that are being stored out here. And you'll see that the name of the chat was Harry Potter, because that was the first question I asked. Then I asked, who is Harry Potter? Is Harry Potter a fictional character? Is a fictional character. So that was the answer it gave me. And then I moved on to the following with the transcript. Now, first off, this particular deployment, this Azure sample for Cosmos DB, it's not multi-tenant, which means that if you give this to two people, they're going to be able to see each other's chats. So you're going to have to do some coding to get this to be multi-tenant. Second part I like about it is for A/B testing, this gives you a good idea of what would my customers be asking and how are they asking questions. That will help you figure out what kind of training you need for your environment or for your users and what kind of prompt engineering training. Because if you turn this over to a user, they're still going to have to know a little bit about prompt engineering to make sure they get the type of answer or the type of response they want. So that's going to be very important. So I think there's a really interesting use case for the ChatGPT backed by Cosmos to track your text. And obviously Cosmos is just the database that ended up getting chosen. You could write it to blob storage. You could write it to Redis cache. You could write it to, wherever you wanted. So I think that's really interesting. All right, let's take a look at our next one. All right, let's look at our last sample here. So under our useful repos, we actually have one called Azure OpenAI Embeddings Q&A. This is basically another chat against your data, which I really like. But what's interesting about this one is they changed it up a little bit. And this is kind of the way that I guess Azure OpenAI is seeing the world pre-build and post-build, if you want to see it that way, or build conference. I'm seeing a lot more information as of recently where we're using vector databases to store the information about the documents that we have stored. Like before, we had actually loaded the documents into a cognitive search index and had a reference to the document sitting in blob storage. This one's done a little bit differently, where you actually take your data set, let's say we're using the same HR documents that we had before, run them through Forms Recognizer, potentially run them through Azure Translator here, which I like. But what is different about this one is this product could be something else. You could have, instead of Forms Recognizer and Azure Translator, these could go from video to speech to text or to video indexer, so that you have basically, you could swap out any cognitive service there. And that's what I like about this one. So then you go to the Azure OpenAI service and get the embeddings, okay? So we actually do have an ADA embeddings model, which will get the embeddings out of the document, store those embeddings in a vector database. Now, right now, I think we've announced this. If we haven't, I'll probably get in trouble for saying this. We do have Azure Cognitive Search Vector Database coming out. It's in private preview right now, but I'm pretty sure we announced it at Build. But you could use pretty much any vector database to do that, including Cosmos Postgres Vector, which GA'd last week, which I'll say, the week prior to June 17th, because obviously my last week's not going to be your last week. And then basically what happens is when you get to the user end, we actually have the users on this end ask a question. It goes through the embeddings, and then it hits the vector database and then goes to the answer prompt to get the answer you want back and respond back. So I like this one a little bit different. I like this one different than I like the others. I think this one opens up some interesting possibilities for swapping out other cognitive services instead of Translator. You could have video stored, you could have audio stored in blob storage, and this could be the solution that you use. So what this would actually look like is this is what you actually get deployed, is the OpenAI, and you'll see, and this looks like an administrator panel, so I really like that too, is that you could actually come in here, take this code, make this your administrator panel, so that you can actually write the code on the back end that goes against the vector database, which in my case, I'm using Redis cache. Because if you drill into this, if we go back, we drill into this, you'll see that there are several options for deploying this. We'll go down. With Azure Cognitive Search, with Azure Cache for Redis, Redis Stack. I went ahead and did it with Redis just because I thought that would be kind of interesting. And the other thing I like about this one is it's one-click deploy. So getting all of this data out there, or getting all this infrastructure out there is really... Now the Cosmos that we did in the last few minutes was also deployed to Azure. So these are easy to get up and running so you can play with them, and I really like that. But what you get here is the OpenAI queries, the chat in there. You've also got add document, which you can drag and drop a document up to, I think you can, or just click browse, up to, 200 meg, PDF, JPEG, or whatever. Add text to the knowledge base, add stuff in batch. I like that. Document viewer, this is what I've already got loaded out here. So we can actually see the documents I've already preloaded. So I've got the benefits, I've got the health benefits, I've got the Perks Plus, the employee handbook. Index management, you can actually see how and where the data is stored a little bit, so you can get some information about how this is set up. There's a sandbox where you can work on your own prompt engineering and see how that goes. And then there's a couple out here for basic summary bullet points explained to a second grader. So you've got some other stuff you can do as well. So, but when you go to chat, it's basically going to work like it did with everything else. So you could, what roles exist in Contoso Electronics, since that's the popular question we asked before. And it will actually hit the vector database instead of the cognitive search, which in this case we get a short list, but so that's not too bad. And it's a good chat interface as well. So this is more of a kind of an administrator type view of the world, but you can take the code and do something else. What roles exist? Provide. So there we go. See if we can't get a little bit more detail there. Yeah, it's giving me kind of basic low-end information. It's like it's not giving me that nice bullet that we had before, but it does give me some role library. It does give me some links where I can actually go down and look at the actual text that was stored that way. It's a little bit different the way it's set up, but you can see that the last thing that it did was the job roles. So it did give me a list of what I was looking for, even though it's not quite as elegant as it was in the other demo. So yeah, that one's I like this one a lot. I think it's interesting because it's yet another way of all the things that I've shown you. This is another way of basically doing documents and how they can actually get set up and work. All right, so the last thing we're going to talk about is the bottom of my repo here, which is going to be blogs and posts. As I find useful blogs and posts, and there are tons of them out there, but I try and pick ones that to try and minimize I don't want to send you a too long didn't read. I could put 100 out here and it still wouldn't be all the ones that exist on the planet. So I'm trying to put some interesting ones that are useful. Some of the stuff is from the Fast Track team. Some of the stuff is going to be from other people within Microsoft. This one I like, the 10 ways generative AI is transforming business, where it actually talks about 10 different use cases. And this might be useful for you to go through, like content creation and design, accelerated automation, personalized marketing, chatbots, and virtual assistants. So this kind of gives you, and the whole point of this video was to kind of give you the art of the possible. We have yet to imagine every way a customer might actually use OpenAI in Azure. So we're always excited to hear and learn about what other customers are doing, as always. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Everyone have a great day.